The US has deployed a sophisticated new radar system in Israel. It's aimed at spotting potential missile fire from Iran. But what about a possible Israeli attack on Iran? Is the US trying to boost Israel's defense to quell its offense? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm Kamal Santamaria. For the first time, the United States has established a permanent military presence in what some call its 51st state. That is, of course, Israel. The US has set up a long-range radar system they claim will protect Israel from any impending attack from its enemies, namely Iran, and it's being set up and run by Americans. Now, the equipment arrived at an Air Force base in the Negev Desert last week, along with 120 American military and support staff who will remain in control of the system. And despite the close relationship between the two countries, Israel has until now preferred to keep control of its own defences, rarely depending on foreign personnel. It is a similar radar system to the Japanese model designed to prevent attack from North Korea, and according to the United States, it could triple the range at which Israel can detect, track and intercept Iranian missiles. So with all this talk of preventing an Iranian missile strike, the obvious question is, how much of a threat does Iran really pose? During a visit to Israel in August, the director of the Pentagon's Missile Defense Agency, Lieutenant General Henry Obering, had this to say. I'm quoting, "The missile threat from Iran is very real. That's why we're working so hard with all our allies to put the most optimized, effective anti-missile capabilities in place." He went on to say, in the context of Israel, if we can take the radar out here and tie it into the Arrow weapon system, they'll be able to launch that interceptor way before they could with an autonomous system. So Israel, it seems, will now be well equipped to stop anything coming out of Iran, except perhaps the Iranian president. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad is a man who never misses the opportunity to threaten Israel. This is what he had to say last week at the United Nations General Assembly in New York.
Today, the Zionist regime is on a definite slope to collapse, and there is no way for it to get out of the cesspool created by itself and its supporters.
Let's bring in our guests at this point. In Tel Aviv is Yossi Melman. He is the intelligence correspondent at the Haaretz newspaper. In Tehran, Saeed Mohammed Marandi, a professor of political science at the University of Tehran. And rounding out our team tonight in Washington, D.C. is the adjunct scholar of the Washington Institute, Raymond Tanter. Gentlemen, many thanks for joining us in Inside Story. I think we need to go back to this before we look at the actual radar system itself, this very central idea of the threat, the Iranian threat. Let me start with Yossi Melman in Tel Aviv. Leaving aside the rhetoric from Ahmadinejad for a moment, if you can, do you really think that Iran would attempt a direct hit on Israel?
It's inseparable words, intentions and capabilities. That's how you measure the other side. And the Israeli government and the Israeli military and the Israeli public above all is measuring Iran according to the rhetorics and the words spoken by President Ahmadinejad, according to their capabilities, which are pretty impressive with missiles above all. And then if you put it together, yes, there is an Iranian threat against Israel, and the installation of the radar system has more of a psychological importance rather than operational. It's operationally, I don't think it would improve tremendously the Israeli defense, air defense capabilities, but psychologically it's a statement from Washington saying we are going to defend Israel if Israel is attacked by Iran or whoever.
Okay, same question to Saeed Mohammed Marandi in Tehran. Let's look at the threat again from your perspective there in Iran. Yossi Melman talks about the rhetoric of Ahmadinejad. Does the rhetoric actually match the true threat?
Well, I don't think there is any rhetoric in that sense, and the Iranian president has never threatened the Zionist regime with a military strike in any way or form. The Iranian president, as do many others, believe that Israel is an apartheid state. It's a racist regime, and they believe that this cannot last, just like apartheid South Africa could not last. That is what they've said repeatedly. That is what he has said repeatedly, and I think that it's quite clear for everyone. I think that the Israeli regime really is trying to change the nature of what he says in order for its own population to accept its government's policies.
Okay then, same question again. I'm going to go to Raymond Tanter in Washington DC. Bearing in mind what Syed Mohammed Marandi has just said, do you think Iran would even want to risk the potential for enormous backlash if it were to make such an attack?
Well, at issue is not the intention of the Iranian regime as expressed either by Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, or by the president Ahmadinejad. At issue is the capabilities of the Iranian regime. And the United States advanced radar system, although it gives Israel 3 times the range at which it can intercept a missile, you have only 11 minutes between launch and the terminal phase. Ballistic missiles go through 3 phases: the boost phase, the mid-course phase, and the terminal phase. So Israel would only gain maybe 2 or 3 minutes before it can decide to launch its interceptor missiles, and the United States would have control. So the operational capabilities, as Mr. Melman indicated, are not at issue as much as the fact of the political significance and the psychological significance of this kind of installation, that it brings Israel in line with the Czech Republic, with Poland. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait have expressed interest in isolating the Iranian regime with a missile defense system among the allies, and Israel's a part of that package.
Okay, so lots of different views there, and that's what we like, of course, on Inside Story. Yossi Melman, if I can come back to you, there is, while we're talking about threats, there is the other threat, if you like, which I'd like to address with you, the fact that Ehud Olmert apparently wanted a direct attack on Iran's nuclear facilities and was put off that by President Bush in the United States. Again, let me ask the same question again. Is that a real threat that anyone should be worried about?
I mean, who said that the Israeli Prime Minister wanted to attack Iran? I never heard him saying that. I cover Israeli military and intelligence for many, many years. The perception here in Tel Aviv is...
Sorry, carry on, sorry.
Yes, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say the suggestion, and it's certainly in the press, is, and this is quoting, obviously, anonymous sources, but talking about the fact that Ehud Olmert actually had to be put off this idea directly by George Bush, who didn't want to see this happen, a direct strike specifically on the nuclear facilities in Iran.
Well, if you want, let's put the facts on the table. How should I, an Israeli independent journalist, react to the comments made by my colleague from Tehran, who is referring to us as the Zionist regime? I can call him the Ayatollah's regime. Will it help? I can call him that they are oppressors of human rights, violators of gender and female rights. So this is rhetorics, and I don't want to be involved in rhetorics. The facts are that Iran doesn't accept the right of Israel to exist. The facts are that Iranian leaders, including military commanders and not only the president, are time and again threatening Israel, saying that Israel doesn't have a right to exist, that Israel is a stinking corpse, that Israel would fade away. They are supporting Hezbollah, which is a terrorist organization by all accounts of Western standards. And therefore, Israel has to prepare for the worst case analysis. And the worst case analysis is that if we are attacked, then Israel would have to respond. I can draw your attention also to the fact that even if Iran is attacked by you Americans, the Iranians had threatened that they would retaliate by attacking Israel, even if Israel is not involved. So Israel is preparing itself. Iran is violating UN UN resolution which is calling upon Iran to stop this, to suspend the uranium enrichment. Iran is not doing so, and the gentleman from Tehran is saying that Israel is threatening Iran. This is completely ridiculous.
Okay, so let's put some of this then to Saeed Mohammed Marandi. I'm sure you've got an answer for this.
Well, obviously, that sort of rhetoric, as your guest in Jerusalem has stated, is something that is repeated regularly in the Western media regarding Iran, and that is, I think, more or less rhetoric. But with regards to the Zionist regime, it is an apartheid state. It is a racist regime. They are supposedly a chosen people, and Palestinians are treated like dirt. No one can hide that. If the Western media doesn't show it, we in the Middle East know the reality on the ground. People in the West Bank and Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, they're facing very harsh conditions, and this is not just over the last couple of years. It's been 60 years now. But again, the reality on the ground is that Iran has never threatened Israel with a military strike. Iran believes that Israel, like apartheid South Africa, cannot continue to exist forever, and the reality is that the people of the region won't accept that. They're fooling themselves if they think that the Palestinians, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Lebanese, the people of the region are going to ever accept such a state in the region. It's nonsense.
Okay,
some governments may say the opposite, but that's not going to happen.
I'm just going to jump in there. Sorry to cut you off there, but we do have to take a break. I would suggest what we've heard so far is that both sides have probably got quite unpleasant things to say about either side. We're going to get back to talking about the missiles and the radar system after the break. They are maybe the closest allies in the world, but what hinders forging a long-term defence pact between the US and Israel? We're back in a moment.